This is a little sideways story to do with videos. I was contacted by the BBC Natural History Unit. I used to do odd bits for them. If they wanted specimens of particular beetles, I would red star them to Bristol. And they asked whether I would guide one of their presenters around some orchids, which I agreed to do. This would have been in 2002. And as some of you may know, I was quite involved in the campaign for hunting. And my Land Rover did have a number of stickers on it. And when a certain presenter, who will remain nameless, arrived at Park Gate Down, he rather sneeringly looked across at me and then looked at his producer or director or whatever. What, you brought me out to see the sort of person who thinks killing animals is conservation? And he refused to apologise. So I refused to show him where the orchids were. I did show the cameraman, and the programme did go out. Okay, ready to roll. Well, good afternoon. Why on earth am I here? As some of you may know, I'm academically an entomologist and ecologist. I've lived on the Minnis for just about 30 years, and a particular interest of mine is in heathland, and the Minnis is a sort of heathland. This is going to be a very rambling sort of conversation, I have to say. So, what is ecology? Ecology is the study of the relationship between organisms and their environment, and organisms and each other. And so you end up with some very particular habitats that have particular plants, particular animals, often defined by the substrate, by the soil or the rock or the nature of the water and the weather. There are other definitions of ecology. There was a very famous American professor called Odom who wrote a hugely long book that I once had to read, where he defined ecology as tracing the route of energy through a system. I rather preferred looking at creepy crawlies myself, so I got a bit bored by his book. But the relationships in themselves have a huge impact. So think about grazing animals and how they impact on things. Think about the impact of not having top-level predators. And if we look at a situation in Holland where they tried rewilding, and they had lots and lots of deer, but they didn't have lots and lots of predators, and in the end their lovely eco-park was covered with deer that had starved to death. You will spot that I'm not necessarily a right-on modern ecologist. I'm not into rewilding. I don't believe that running a bison farm somewhere north of Canterbury is very sensible. And I do believe there are some good recipes for beaver. So, classic heathland is very poor ground. And as we heard from William's talk, the lords of the manor often declared the worst of the land to be the common land, because it wasn't productive land. Now, unproductive land is ecologically very interesting, because it requires a level of speciality from the plants and animals that live there. Classic heathland would be found more in the west of the country, so in Dorset and places, on very sandy soils. And the result of those very sandy soils, and this is a profile at Hofffield Common, and you can see a dark brown layer there, which is an iron pan. All of the nutrients above that have been washed out. That's pure sand. There's almost no nutrient in that at all. There's also no water, because sand is very free draining. So the sorts of plants that you're going to find there have got to be very good at conserving water, rather like cacti in deserts. But we have a different set of ways in which heathland plants do this. We're not on a sandy soil. Well, there are pockets of sand around. And anyone who's done groundwork locally will tell you that you think you're just going to put in some footings and then suddenly you hit a pocket of sand, and the poor old customer, the price goes up because putting in the foundations or whatever's required becomes more expensive. So what can we expect to find on the Minnis? Well, just looking at the gorse there and the heather, what's interesting about gorse and heather, their leaves are incurved. So the stomata through which they lose moisture actually are pointing into a microclimate that remains quite humid. So they conserve water. They don't need as much water. And you'll find that with an awful lot of heathland plants. Low nutrient soils are often acid, and the soil of the Minnis is slightly acid. Along with that, you get the associated insects. The one featured there is a favourite of mine. My specialism, I have to say, is dung beetles. Dragonflies, heteropteran bugs, orthoptera, coleoptera, but dung beetles are the kings, and we must be grateful to them, because without them, we'd be up to here in it. They bury the dung, which makes them very effective recyclers. And interestingly, and I'm very glad to say, there's a big move in agriculture these days with people looking at soil structure and the importance of invertebrates in maintaining a good soil structure and bringing organic matter down into the soil. And dung beetles are very, very good at this. A little by the way, we have 99 species of dung beetle in this country. Although some of them don't look very dungy and don't have much to do with dung, the chafers and the maybugs belong to the same family. Sadly, we don't have any beetles that roll dung. You'd have to go down to the middle of France before you'll come across any rollers. This one is the minotaur beetle, which you'll see on the common. You'll often see what looks like a miniature molehill with a hole next to it. Now, you'll find that next to some of the cattle dung. And that's probably not this beetle. That's probably another dung beetle called Geotrupes. This one particularly likes rabbit dung. Sadly, it doesn't roll the pellets. It chews them up. And the female digs a shaft. And in sandy soils, that shaft can be 2 meters deep. The male, pictured here with the rather splendid horns, just hangs around, really. He doesn't do a lot. I see 1 or 2 faces smiling at that, but I shall make no comment and name no names. What's interesting is at the bottom of that shaft, the female excavates a hand-shaped pattern of galleries, and she stocks the fingers with dung. But she lays her eggs at the end of the thumb. So when the eggs hatch, the larvae, the first stage of the larvae, if they're going to survive, have to be strong enough to get to the dung. Any that are born weak, if they were on the dung, they might use up some of the food resource required by their fitter brothers. So evolution starts right there, at the beginning of these beetles emerging from the eggs. There's also a dragonfly that does a very similar thing that you'll see on the Minnis called Ischna cyanea. I'm sorry to say I'm not very good at English names for things. I was given a plant book when I was about 6, and for ages I thought my father had declared war on Bellis perennis. And I didn't understand that my schoolmates had daisies and they were the same thing. So we have this poor soil, but as I've said, it's not classic sandy soil. But we are in a very dry part of the country, just at the moment, far too blooming dry. Some of you may be enjoying this. I'm praying for rain, and if I wasn't so lame at the moment, I'd be doing a rain dance each evening. I want it to rain steadily from 10 o'clock at night until 4:30 every morning for about 2 weeks, with a chance for the grass to grow. I'm running a bit short of grass. We do have low rainfall, and the impoverishment of the soil is also related to the level of grazing. And you heard William say that 1,040 sheep could be grazing on the Minnis, plus the cattle, the goats, the 2 pigs, the geese. And that's extractive management. Commoners would have put their stock out onto the Minnis, but most of them have taken the stock off at night, back onto their own land, where they would tend to dung, which is what you want. You want enrichment of your field, so you bring your stock back onto a field that you're going to plant with grain later in the year. But you're constantly extracting nutrient from the system, which is exactly what you want in heathland. You want the soil to be as poor as possible. If we, and someone's probably already done this photograph, that's an area view of 1946, and there is nary a tree to be seen. There are very few trees on Stelling Minnis Common that are more than 70 years old. It was a big open expanse, and as Phyllis Champion, bless her, took great delight in telling me when I first moved up here, you could stand at Harry Lock's garage and see the bus leave the village shop. I suppose that's the other reason I'm sitting here talking to you, is that in 1993, soon after we moved to the Minnis, I published an ecologically based management plan for the Minnis, which made me some enemies and a few friends, which enabled the managers on behalf of the owners to acquire countryside stewardship funding. And that's just coming up for renewal. And I know that Ivor and John and others are working on that even as we speak. And that funding is really quite important. The fact that we can safely have cattle out there requires you to have the collars, it requires you to have the underground wire. I'm in huge admiration for William and the other trustees. Owning the common is a huge liability. It could just drain you. And yet they are very committed to it, which I think is absolutely wonderful. You're going to get a bit bored with me saying enrichment and impoverishment, I'm afraid. But a lovely example, or it should have been if my notes were in the right order. If you, a bit earlier in the year, had still on the Bosingham Road and looked along the Bosingham Road, you would have seen a band 2 meters wide of broad-leafed grasses, cow parsley, some other plants as well. Actually, the sort of plants that require high levels of nutrient. After that 2 meter band, the grasses become fine-leaved, so classic heathland plants. Fine leaves, you don't lose so much water. So why do we get these much more hungry plants growing next to the road? And it's simply because 1 meter strips mown off, and the cuttings are left on there. And as the cuttings rot down, they enrich the ground, and it leaches another meter into the Minnis. So you get this strip of enriched ground. Straying from the Minnis for a while, if you look at something like the bank as you go down to Dean Farm, which is also mown off, but the cuttings get washed down onto the road, so it's not enriched. So you've got 3 species of orchid growing there, which if it was level ground and the cuttings were left on, the orchids would be pushed out. They wouldn't be able to compete with the nettle and the anthriscus and the other plants. So we have got heather, we have got gorse, we've got heathland grasses, associated animals, western gorse, Ulex gallii, which is common in the West Country, and there are, I think now, only 2 sites in Kent for it. It's very unusual to find it this far west. It should still be on the Minnis. I must confess that the shape of my life these days, I don't spend a lot of time on the Minnis, but there should still be western gorse plants there. And I know that the other site, which was at Aldington, has now gone under a housing development. So if we've still got western gorse, we're one of 2 sites in Kent, that's all. We also are a site of a nationally notable beetle, Pterosticus quadrimaculatus. which basically looks like an awful lot of other ground beetles until you put it under a microscope. But for someone like me, it's really quite exciting. It's even more exciting because with a lot of beetles, to identify them down to species, you can't do it externally. You have to find a male. You have to extract its genitalia. You then clear them in caustic potash to get rid of the fats, and then you clear further in alcohol, and then you study them under a microscope. Under those circumstances, I do feel it's only fair to kill them first. But I have received hate mail from animal rights people and threats to my life, because not only was I a fox hunting man, but they found out I had a collection of specimens of beetles, and apparently this was appalling. The fact that my collection went to museums and is used by people studying groups of insects means nothing to these people. Bracken's an interesting plant. It's really clever. What you see is a leaf. The stem is underground. It produces a small amount of honeydew, which, if it's attacked, and there are very few insects that eat bracken, interesting, at Hothfield Common, there's a New Zealand weevil that does, but if it gets attacked, it produces more of the honeydew, and the ants arrive to harvest the honeydew, and they will attack anything that's attacking their plant. So the ants defend the bracken. Any of you who pulled up bracken by hand will know that if you slip, the cell walls are very sharp, and you can get like paper cuts in your hand. That tends to put off grazing animals because they don't really like having lacerated tongues. It contains some chemicals which are partly responsible for esophageal cancers in cattle. It's okay if the cattle eat it when it's very young, at the crosier stage, when it's just a little hook sticking up, but beyond that it's actually toxic. It also produces a chemical, both when it's alive and when it's rotting down, that inhibits the germination of the seeds of flowering plants. So it's very good at dominating an area. And in fact, internationally, bracken is the single plant responsible for the loss of most agricultural land. We were even clever enough to introduce it to New Zealand. But bless our cotton socks. Why is it important? Well, it's there. It's a very diminished habitat. There are people who think it's wrong to cut down trees on the Minnis. If there was no management of the Minnis, it would become a woodland. It would be a problematic woodland because sycamore would do really well. And sycamore is an introduced tree. It was introduced without its pests. Nothing eats its seeds, even the squirrels don't eat its seed, so lots of the seeds germinate. And it's host to about 12 species of insect, all of which in this country can be found on other trees. None of them are just specific to sycamore. Whereas our oak tree is host to 290 species of insect, many of which rely wholly on the oak. So we have a woodland with lots of sycamore. There'd be a fair amount of oak, a fair amount of birch for a while until the oak pushed it out. And so the actual Minnis would probably end up, for a while anyway, with more species of insect, bird and mammal than it currently has. But that would deplete Kent's biodiversity. Maintaining this mosaic, having heathland here, having heathland at Hothfield, adds to Kent's biodiversity. And to understand biodiversity and its importance, you have to look at the bigger picture. You can't, it's hopeless to look at one small picture. And how these people are getting away with the country's going to be better when everything's planted with trees and we import all of our food from abroad, I really don't understand. That will reduce biodiversity in this country by an order of magnitude. We need the mosaic, we need the variety. What makes this important is it's a heathland. That's interesting. The dark areas are possible heathland. If we went for full-scale restoration based around the Minnis, you'll note that it actually coincides with the clay cap on top of the chalk and a lot of forestry plantation, because forestry plantation took advantage of poor ground. It was cheap. Top-grade agricultural land was expensive, poor grade, cheap, buy it up, plant it with trees. Threats and limitations. There's a slight difficulty here. I'm looking at the common at the moment, I suppose like a nature reserve. But it's much more than that, as we heard from William. But these are problems. Human activity. Are there any ground nesting birds on the common? No. Because of the weight of pressure from people and the number of dogs. People quite rightly taking air and exercise, which they have a legal right to do, which is fine. There is an imbalance. We should have nightjars on the common. It's perfect habitat for nightjars. We should have lots of hedgehogs. Unfortunately, we've got lots of badgers, which I'm told by the animal rights people I should refer to as wood pandas, because apparently that makes them more lovable. I know the one thing that makes them more lovable to me, but I'm not allowed to say it. Those who watch Clarkson's Farm, the second series, will know that Jeremy and I share a very similar view. Enrichment along the side. Why that slide slipped in there, I don't know. But you can see very clearly the difference just by mowing and leaving the cuttings on. For the ecologist, restore it to full heathland, get rid of all the trees, encourage the kaluna, the heathers, the other things, restrict human access, dogs always on leads, periodic intensive grazing, and control predators. But it's not a nature reserve. So realistically, controlled grazing, really useful. That's actually taking nutrients away. People say, but the cow pats on the Minnis. Yeah, when the cows leave the Minnis, they're heavier than when they went on. That's come from somewhere. And that's extractive. That's what you need to maintain it. You need to reduce the scrub, because it's encroaching. My view is that you need to leave scrub so it breaks up the areas. One of the things I love about the Minnis is you can walk when there are lots of other people there and you don't have to see them. Because if you know where you're going, you can take a route where they're behind trees or scrub. Removal of dangerous and alien trees, I get rid of all the sycamore. It's not adding anything. Pasture woodland's good, so what the cattle are doing at the moment, grazing under the trees, is brilliant. That's a really valuable habitat. Reducing nutrient levels and controlling bracken, although I understand that even though we have left Europe, which means that we could license the use of azulam, which is a very good, very specific herbicide that controls docks, sorrels, and bracken, and harms nothing else, it looks like that's not going to come back onto the market. So the best answer is just keep mowing it off. A better answer would be to mow it off and gather the cuttings. But that's very labor intensive. But if you keep knocking it or crushing it, crushed stems, in Wales they use angled rollers in the hill country to crush the stems. And I think that's it. That's my overview of the ecology of the Minnis.